The room was already restless, a storm disguised as stillness. Cameras hummed, pens hovered, and somewhere in the back row, a journalist whispered, "This is about to get ugly." Elizabeth Warren sat upright, composed but burning with conviction, her notes perfectly stacked. Across the long mahogany table, Senator John Kennedy leaned back, eyes steady, that familiar half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For a brief second, no one breathed. Then Kennedy leaned forward, elbows pressing into the polished wood, his voice slicing through the silence. "Senator," he said, each word deliberate, almost too calm, "may I ask you something? Simple?" The sound of shuffling papers stopped. Warren blinked once, caught slightly off guard by the tone, not confrontational, not mocking, just eerily calm. Cameras focused tighter, Kennedy continued, his southern drawl steady. "If your plan for fairness leaves the working man with less freedom, how's that fair?" A pause. A deep one. Warren's lips parted, but no words came. Even the air seemed to hesitate, waiting. The aides exchanged glances, one clearing his throat to fill the vacuum of silence. Kennedy didn't move. He just watched her, patient, knowing. But what Kennedy said next didn't just silence Warren. It changed the entire tone of the hearing. To the public, this wasn't just another Senate hearing. It was a collision between two visions of America, one built on intellectual blueprints and moral certainty, the other grounded in plain talk and lived reality. Millions watched from home, scrolling through live updates and waiting for anyone to speak for them. On one side sat Elizabeth Warren, the professor turned senator, armed with charts, policy briefs, and the language of reform. She spoke of closing corporate loopholes, of fairness measured through the lens of redistribution and regulation. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who had studied every line, every decimal, every law that tilted the scales of justice. Across from her, John Kennedy represented something less polished, but more instinctive, the everyman's skepticism of elite control. He didn't quote studies or flash data slides. He told stories about small business owners drowning under promises that never reached them. His words were slower, softer, but they hit differently. Where Warren saw systems, Kennedy saw people. Where she sought design, he demanded accountability. And beneath their clash was something far deeper than tax policy. It was about the soul of public service itself. Who truly understood fairness? Who really stood with the working class when the cameras turned off? The tension wasn't just ideological. It was personal, emotional, generational. The country itself seemed split down the middle. Those who believed in government intervention, and those who feared it had gone too far. Both senators walked into that chamber sure of victory, certain of their own moral ground. But in politics, certainty can be a dangerous thing. Because to understand why Kennedy's question landed so hard, you have to see who he really was, and what he represented to his supporters. Elizabeth Warren's story began far from the marble floors of the Capitol. She was the daughter of a maintenance worker and a telephone operator, a girl who watched her mother pick up extra shifts just to keep the lights on. That struggle never left her. It became the blueprint of her identity, a relentless drive to challenge the systems that she believed punished the poor and rewarded the powerful. In her mind, fairness wasn't abstract, it was personal. Every hearing, every speech, every policy fight was in some way a defense of her younger self, the girl who once feared losing her home. By the time she became a Harvard law professor, she was known not only for her intellect, but for her moral certainty. Her lectures were electric, equal parts academic rigor and emotional conviction. She had a way of making law sound like a moral mission, not just a profession. But that same conviction that inspired thousands of students also alienated some colleagues. To them, she wasn't just persuasive, she was unyielding. When she entered the political arena, Warren brought that same energy with her. On the campaign trail, she talked about corruption like a prosecutor building a case. She pointed fingers, named names, and spoke in moral absolutes. For many Americans, it was refreshing. Finally, someone with courage to call out the system. But over time, her tone began to change. The moral clarity that once gave her strength started to sound to her critics like moral superiority. Every TV appearance turned into a duel. Every debate became an indictment. She didn't just want to win, she wanted to teach. And in Washington, that line between teacher and preacher can turn admiration into resentment fast. The same sharp mind that dissected Wall Street executives also cut down her colleagues, sometimes without her realizing it. And yet, there was something undeniably human about her. She wasn't arrogant for the sake of power. She truly believed she was right. Her fight for the middle class, her crusade against billionaires and loopholes, came from a place of sincerity. But sincerity can't always hide the heat of self-righteousness. Inside the Senate chamber, that tension was always visible. She sat like a scholar in a battlefield, armed with facts, unaware that sometimes emotion, not evidence, wins the room. Her confidence filled every inch of space, but her empathy didn't always make it to the microphone. So when John Kennedy entered that same arena, he wasn't just facing a political opponent. He was confronting an institution of intellect, a woman who believed she had already won the argument before it began. What she didn't see was that Kennedy wasn't preparing to outsmart her. He was preparing to outmaneuver her in a language she rarely understood, the language of humility and humor. Meanwhile, across the aisle, John Kennedy was preparing something no one, not even Warren, saw coming. John Neely Kennedy grew up far from the echoing halls of Washington, in the quiet heart of Louisiana, where conversations happened on porches, not podiums. His childhood was shaped by the kind of people who didn't have time for theory. Farmers, small-town shopkeepers, and working men whose lessons came not from books, but from hard days in the sun. From them, Kennedy learned something no Ivy League education could teach: how to speak plainly, think sharply, and see through pretense. When he went on to earn degrees from Vanderbilt, Virginia, and Oxford, he didn't trade that plain talk for polish. Instead, he carried both, the academic rigor of a scholar and the grounded instincts of a man who knew his neighbors by name. In the Senate, that combination made him unpredictable. To some, he was the funny one, the man with quick one-liners that softened tension. But behind that humor was a legal intellect honed to precision, one that could take apart an argument the way a surgeon handles a scalpel. Kennedy's charm wasn't an act. It was armor. He used humor to disarm, patience to mislead, and silence to corner his opponents. While others talked to impress, Kennedy listened, waiting, calculating, letting the other side overextend. When his turn finally came, he didn't unleash a storm of statistics or theories. He simply asked a question, short and sharp, that made the entire room stop breathing. In a city full of speeches, Kennedy preferred moments, the kind people remembered long after the microphones turned off. His voice carried that deliberate Southern cadence, slow enough to sound gentle, yet filled with an unmistakable edge. It was the rhythm of a man who understood that truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to land. To the American public, Kennedy represented something deeply familiar: common sense dressed in wit. He spoke the way their fathers might, cutting through political fog with one clean sentence. When he challenged policy, it wasn't to score points. It was to remind everyone that politics was supposed to serve the people, not itself. And while Warren built her arguments like a professor constructing a thesis, Kennedy dismantled them like a country lawyer who'd seen too many good people buried under bureaucracy. Her logic dazzled. His logic connected. She aimed for admiration. He aimed for understanding. That's why when he leaned forward in that Senate hearing, his voice calm and his eyes steady, the moment felt different. This wasn't arrogance facing intellect. It was conviction meeting simplicity, two worlds, two languages, colliding under the bright lights of Washington. So when the cameras started rolling and the microphones flicked on, the stage was set, and not for a debate but for a reckoning. Under the bright Senate lights, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Elizabeth Warren leaned slightly forward, her papers neatly stacked, her tone crisp and commanding. Each sentence landed like a calculated strike, dense with data, precision, and conviction. She was in her element, breaking down policy and power with the confidence of a seasoned professor addressing a classroom. Across from her sat Senator John Kennedy, relaxed, composed, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. His southern drawl rolled gently over his words, disarming in rhythm but deliberate in meaning. Where Warren wielded intellect like a sword, Kennedy preferred to use patience like a trap. As she spoke about regulatory oversight and corporate accountability, the room hummed with approval. The crowd leaned in, journalists scribbling, cameras flickering, whispers swelling in the gallery. But Kennedy didn't interrupt. He waited, observed, studied her phrasing. Then, when she paused to breathe, he struck, not with aggression, but with quiet precision. "Senator," he began slowly, "you've said a lot about responsibility, but who decides when responsibility turns into control?" The words hung in the air. Warren blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She recovered quickly, firing back with statistics, references, and a polished rebuttal that sounded airtight. Yet something had shifted. Kennedy wasn't debating numbers. He was debating values. Each time she answered, he peeled another layer away. "You talk about protecting the people," he said, leaning closer now. "But do you trust them to think for themselves?" The crowd grew still. Cameras zoomed tighter. Even Warren's voice, once sharp and certain, began to edge with caution. The rhythm changed, her confidence measured, his calm unshaken, and then Kennedy leaned forward, his voice steady, and asked a question that would stop everything. Kennedy's voice cut through the tension like a quiet thunderclap. "Senator Warren," he began, his drawl slow and deliberate, "you've spoken beautifully about fairness, about holding power accountable. But let me ask you something plain." He paused, just long enough for the silence to become heavy. Cameras zoomed in. Pens stopped scratching. Warren's chin lifted slightly, her eyes sharp. Kennedy leaned forward. "If you believe no one should have too much power over ordinary Americans, then tell me this, why do your policies give more of it to Washington?" The question landed like a crack in the air. A ripple passed through the room. A few heads turned. Someone in the back coughed just to break the silence. Warren blinked, as if replaying the words in her mind. Her lips parted, ready to respond, but nothing came out at first. Kennedy didn't move. He didn't smirk or gloat. He just waited. Calm. Still. Watching her carefully, like a man who already knew the answer. Warren exhaled, then adjusted her papers. "Senator, that's a false choice," she said finally, her tone steady but softer now. "Strong regulation isn't about taking power. It's about protecting people from exploitation." Kennedy nodded slightly, as though humoring her. "Fair enough," he said. "But who protects them from you? From the ones making those rules?" Gasps, audible, sharp. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't cruel, Keith, but it pierced the moment like lightning. The air thickened. The audience leaned forward. Even the reporters froze, sensing they were witnessing something rare, a shift. The kind of moment that makes headlines before anyone even leaves the room. Warren's expression hardened. "That's not a serious question," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Oh, I think it is," Kennedy replied softly. "You said corporations shouldn't have unchecked authority. I agree. But if we don't trust the few who make money, why should we trust the few who make laws?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. Cameras clicked furiously. Aides exchanged glances. Somewhere, someone whispered, "Oh my God." Warren opened her mouth again, searching for footing. The professor in her tried to reassert control, policy points, legislative nuance, moral appeal, but her rhythm was gone. Her certainty had been cracked open by something simpler than data, human doubt. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He just sat back, hands folded, letting the silence do the work. In that silence you could hear the flicker of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of someone's shoe, the faint hum of air conditioning. It was the sound of power shifting, from intellect to instinct. Warren tried again. "Senator, I believe in accountability for everyone." He leaned in, his eyes steady. "Then we agree," he said softly. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, final. She paused, realizing that continuing would only dig deeper. The words she'd prepared and gone. The authority she commanded, shaken. The moderator glanced nervously between them, unsure whether to move on or let the silence breathe. The audience sat frozen in collective disbelief. Then, as if on cue, the room erupted, not in applause but in murmurs, startled, low, electric. Journalists began typing furiously. Staffers whispered into phones. And in the upper gallery, a young reporter mouthed the words that would soon flood every screen. "Did you just see what Kennedy said?" By the time Warren composed herself and the hearing resumed, the story had already left the room. Tweets were flying. Hashtags were forming. Clips were being cut before the debate had even ended. And while Warren gathered her notes, trying to recover her rhythm, Kennedy simply leaned back, calm as ever, the faintest trace of a knowing smile crossing his face, because he understood something the cameras couldn't capture, that in Washington, the loudest voice doesn't always win. Sometimes, it's the quietest question that breaks the room. But the real shock came hours later, when social media exploded, and Washington couldn't stop talking about it. Within hours, the clip had become impossible to avoid. Every major network ran it on loop. CNN called it the silence that shook the Senate. Fox labeled it Kennedy's knockout question, and social media turned it into a digital wildfire. The 7-second pause between Kennedy's words and Warren's first response became the most replayed silence in Washington that week. TikToks and YouTube shorts dissected it frame by frame, zooming in on Warren's eyes, Kennedy's posture, the moment her fingers froze above her notes. Edits flooded timelines with dramatic music, slow motion, and captions like "This is when she knew," or "The question no one dared ask." On talk shows, the reactions split along fault lines. Warren's supporters rallied, arguing she'd been ambushed by political theatrics. "She's one of the few still fighting for the middle class," one pundit said passionately. "One clever soundbite doesn't erase years of moral clarity." Others, especially Kennedy's backers, celebrated his composure as a triumph of authenticity over rhetoric. Memes hailed him as the gentleman gladiator, while his quote, "Who protects them from you?" trended for 2 straight days. Hashtags like Warren silence or Kennedy moment and question of the year swept across X and Instagram. Comment sections turned into miniature town halls, half the nation debating the meaning of accountability, the other half just enjoying the drama. But beyond the frenzy, something deeper was happening. People weren't just reacting to politics, they were reacting to human truth. That unguarded silence, that flicker of vulnerability, had struck a chord bigger than partisanship. It reminded viewers that even the most powerful can be caught off guard when ideals collide with reality. Late-night hosts joked about it. Analysts overanalyzed it. But ordinary Americans watched and wondered, if one simple question could shake a Senate star, what did that say about the system itself? In classrooms, offices, and kitchen tables, the conversation lingered. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about honesty, pressure, and how easily confidence can crumble under the weight of truth. And as the noise grew louder, a quieter truth began to emerge, one that said more about character than politics. The Senate chamber stood nearly empty now, its marble walls still holding the echo of what had just unfolded. The chairs, once filled with restless energy, sat in quiet stillness, as if the building itself understood the weight of what it had witnessed. Elizabeth Warren's silence, John Kennedy's steady question, and that split second of truth hung in the air like a memory that refused to fade. For those watching across the country, it wasn't just another political exchange. It was a reminder that integrity doesn't need a microphone, and truth doesn't tremble when challenged. In an era of noise, that one unexpected question cut deeper than 1,000 speeches. This was more than a headline. It was a moment when politics paused and character spoke. If you believe truth still matters, if you believe dignity should always rise above division, share this story. Let others hear the silence that spoke louder than words. Because long after the cameras turned off, one truth still stands. Sometimes the most powerful answer is no answer at all. When the dust settled and the headlines began to fade, what remained wasn't the clash of two ideologies. It was the echo of a single, unguarded silence. In that still moment, stripped of speeches and strategy, the Senate chamber became a mirror for something far larger than politics. It became a stage for truth. John Kennedy hadn't won because he shouted louder or outmaneuvered his opponent. He won because he stayed calm in the storm. His composure reminded everyone watching that confidence without humility is fragile, and that real strength doesn't need to shout.